Hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. So I'm just going to briefly make a few announcements and then introduce Amy very briefly. So we have 3 upcoming lectures. On April 13th, we have Brian Crabtree, a.k.a. Monome. On April 21st, we have Krzysztof Wodyczko. And on May 5th, we have Natalie Jermenjenko. So these are including tonight, the 4 last lectures of the year. I know for a fact they're all going to be excellent, so I hope to see you here for the rest. There's also, of course, more info at www.dma.ucla.edu. So I think we're extremely lucky to have Amy here tonight. She's been traveling a lot lately. She's just back from Montreal and before that Baltimore with an exhibition there. So I'm just very glad that she could come down and be with us for the evening. So Amy founded a group called Futurefarmers in 1995. So to paraphrase a little bit from their description online, Futurefarmers is a group of artists and designers working together. So it's a collaborative work. Futurefarmers are teachers, researchers, designers, gardeners, scientists, engineers, illustrators, pattern makers, cooks, and bus drivers with a common interest in creating work that challenges current social, political, and economic systems. So Amy's currently teaching at the California College of Arts and at University of San Francisco. And with that, I'll give her the floor.
Hello. I'm just going to set my clock. Hello. Peter, thank you for sitting in front. I'm really honored to be here. I've never been to this department, so it's really an honor because I've looked in through your portal online for years. And it's really exciting because a lot of ghosts are here today. David Elliott, Kevin, Chris, Peter, so it's kind of like a reunion. When I was asked to come down here, I actually was thinking a lot about when I was in graduate school. I know a lot of you are undergrads, but I wanted to start, just begin before I show work, talking about Futurefarmers, as Casey said, it's a design studio that we use a lot of our profit from our design studio to make artwork. And it's, for us, it's basically 3 of us. It's an interesting model because we do fund a lot of our own work. We have a lot more kind of freedom. A lot of times you have to apply for grants and spell out things, or when you do things in museums, everything has to kind of be spelled out, and I'll talk about that more later, but that is kind of the basic model. We did a lot of things online from like 1995 until 2000, and then we all kind of decided, Josh On is a partner, or he's a loose partner now, but we all kind of decided we had different interests. Josh is a hardcore activist. I kind of wanted to do things that weren't so much technologically based, and just kind of go back to my original art practice. And Michael Swain, he was another collaborator, kind of swirled around between those 2 things. So I went to grad school at Stanford, and I just wanted to kind of walk through that time here. So I found that when I got to Stanford, I felt it was a very conservative atmosphere. In undergrad, I went to the San Francisco State, and I spent a lot of time at Berkeley going to protests, and the campuses were totally live every day. There was people screaming about something every hour of the day, and it was just like this cacophony. And I got to Stanford, and there was nothing going on, no protests, totally quiet. And I started asking people, like, do people protest here? Or is there a space for free speech? And they're like, oh, yeah, it's like up on a white stage, and you have to sign up, and it's only an hour a day. And I was like, okay, there has to be some subculture, radical culture here. And so this is just this weird image that I have. When I was in undergrad, I felt like at San Francisco State, the departments were very segregated, and I always felt like I was a multidisciplinarian, and this is sort of this image of the institution trying to cut off the arms of the multidisciplinarian to create a specialist. And so I decided to go into the archives because I couldn't find anyone alive that was doing anything radical or critiquing sort of this conservative environment that I felt I was in. I would go to colloquiums in the computer science department and sociology and aerospace to try to find like the freaks. And so I went into the archives, and was like, okay, Stanford Research Institute was doing weird things back in the 60s. I'm on this campus where people were at one point taking drugs and measuring their brain changes while they were on drugs. I can't believe this was happening here. At one time, the Aerospace Department had projected that this torus would be going in orbit around the Earth by 1986. This was a Stanford torus, drawn by Don Davis. This is another drawing of what it would be like inside. There'd be a whole civilization. Looks very kind of suburban, Mediterranean. Here's another image. And these projections of what this orbiting space station would be like are actually a lot like Palo Alto. If you look kind of closely, there's this, kind of Arcadia. I also found in the archives there was a box where there was all the Homebrew Computer Club newsletters. And probably all of you know the Homebrew Computer Club, but for me, when I found it, I had not heard of it. It was a group of tinkerers. Bill Gates was one of them, Wozniak, Lee Felsenstein, who were trying to create the personal computer. And they didn't have all the tools and all the skills, so they got together and skill shared and tried to develop it together. And this was the first issue where they decided, let's make a newsletter and let's draw everybody's portrait who was here, and we'll document our meetings. I don't know if it was a year or so later, but Bill Gates got kind of frustrated with all this sharing, and he took off to New Mexico and developed his own, hired people, and kind of got mad at the Homebrew Computer Club, and certain people disbanded and went different directions. This was something else I found in the archives, which was sort of the first email list in Berkeley. Some of you have heard of it, Computer Memory. It was, Dave, I thought you would like this. It was basically attempting to be a listserv, but it was still very analog. This was an excerpt out of the Homebrew Computer Club. You can just read it quickly. And I think what really inspired me about this and the Homebrew Computer Club was this collective learning space, that there was a collective trajectory, and that it wasn't about who's going to take credit for it, but it was really about let's all try to do this together, and it's about learning. This was a project by Steve Dompierre, who was part of the Homebrew Computer Club, and when I saw this drawing, I was like, what is this? And basically, he had this Altair computer that he had ordered online, or not online, through the mail, and he was programming it, a little calculation, and while he was doing it, his radio started buzzing as it was processing, and it was like, as it would compute, it would start and change and buzz, and so he kind of decided to program something that would play a Beatles song. So as it would calculate, and as it was near a radio, the radio would buzz the tune of the Beatles. And I was like, that's great. These sort of accidental things are happening. As well, in that box, I found this magazine, which was called A Radical Guide to Stanford. And I was like, wow, finally, I've hit the gold pot. And so what happened was in the late 60s, there was a group of computer scientists who were really fed up with the politics of Stanford. They were engaged in research that was leaning towards electronic warfare. The war in Vietnam was on, and a lot of the boards of trustees at Stanford were involved in those politics. And so they decided to ask, they were like, we want to protest, but we also want to understand this world that we're in, and we don't want to take part in it in the way we are. So they asked teachers on campus to teach an alternative syllabus, and many teachers got together and did that for 2 months in Encina Hall, and shortly they were kicked out, and the students dropped out and started their own school called Mid-Peninsula Free University. But in the Radical Guide, it only lasted for about 2 years. It was basically for new students to kind of get them acquainted with the politics of the campus. So there were basic survival skills. This is something else, sorry, I'll skip forward. There was introductions to who the president was and sort of the politics he was involved in, and then a list of all the board of trustees. And other boards that they sat on, which is pretty interesting. And so this was a syllabus and a flyer from the Mid-Peninsula Free University, which was all taught in houses, and it was an itinerant school that basically sprung up when it needed to and kind of disappeared when there wasn't a need. But it lasted for 13 years, and some of the classes are, I mean, it's very aligned with the times. It was the 60s, so, you know, there was like occult and astrology workshops, the Aquarian Age, the I Ching study group. I think there was one called Staring at the Pond. And then the school actually published a newspaper called The Free U, and it was really heavily critiqued by Stanford, and a lot of sort of contention happened in Palo Alto around this, and the Mid-Peninsula Free U broke down and basically turned into like radical activists and then sort of academics who returned to academia. These were put all over Palo Alto and the Bay Area, invitations to teach. Anyone could teach and anyone could come to learn. So I just want to share that with you. And then after grad school, I was sort of seeking something like a homebrew computer club. I was like, where is this happening? And I had moved to Belgium, and there was a group called Code 31 that was really inspired by Homebrew Computer Club, and I happened to be there the first month they became. And it's just basically a tinkering group. So I just wanted to share that with you. If you're interested, they have a listserv, and they're pretty active. And then another place I had visited was called Garage Festival in the north of Germany, and it was the first festival I'd ever been to that was about production. They did have displays of things, but they really invited artists to come and make something new, and if you finished it, great, but if you didn't, that's fine. They were really more into the energy of bringing artists together in a production phase. So it was about a 2-week festival. Everybody ate together and then sort of tinkered on their own. So that's just a little kind of things that inspired me, and now I'll go into some actual work. Sorry. So this is a sculpture that I just wanted to show you that was in a sort of transition period where Futurefarmers was doing a lot of online work, and museums were asking us to do internet-based works. And at this time, Futurefarmers was really young, and some quite great institutions were asking us to do internet-based work. And we'd get really excited and go, yeah, okay, let's do work. We want to do something at the Walker Art Center. And then we would kind of debilitate, like, our idea had to be internet-based. And so we kind of kept getting stuck, and we got frustrated, and we're like, you know what, actually, maybe it's better for us not to do this project now because we have other ideas that aren't internet-based, and it's just not the right fit. And we kind of took some risks and didn't show at institutions. And this was a reaction piece. People were asking us to do interactive, internet-based projects. And we kind of thought, what's the most simple structure of interaction? And we just built this seesaw that was exhibited in a gallery in San Francisco. It was 14 feet long, and 10 or 12 people could actually use it at once. The gallerist actually owns it now because she fell in love with it. She would get people on it during the day and like turn it into a therapy session. Another sort of reactive piece was we wanted to put some work in ArtBots in New York, and it says you have to make a robot. And so we sent this was kind of a sketch of a photosynthesis robot, thinking that could you actually propel something forward using photosynthesis? So if the plant reaches for the sun, it would slowly propel forward. And ArtBots accepted it. And I think the most interesting thing was, which kind of threw us into a new way of thinking about sculpture and kind of objects, was that ArtBots wrote and they said, how far is it going to travel? Because it'll be here for a month. And how far away do we have to keep it from the wall so that it doesn't hit the wall? And we were like, God, that's so beautiful that they've implanted all of those, realities into this non-functional piece. So that kind of made us reinvigorated about the power of a non-animated object or a connected object. And so I wanted to show you. This was a project ISEA commissioned us to do in San Jose in 2006. And it was really inspired by my time at Stanford and also thinking about what is ISEA. Again, it's an electronic arts festival. And at that time, we were all kind of like, well, we're not really doing electronic work, but we do a lot of work online for commercial work. We're using all these electronic tools. Maybe our position at this festival can be a critique of the industry that's propelling us forward, which actually, sorry, I'm going to jump to something else, which actually started earlier. I'll go back to that project in a second. Yerba Buena Center for the Arts asked us to be in a show called it's called Bang the Machine. It was a gaming show. And we were like, we actually make games online, but we're not so into gaming culture, but we're curious about your show. And so they invited us to talk about their intentions. And one thing they were doing was they were having, it was sponsored by the United States Army, and they were having America's Army built three-dimensionally. I don't know if anybody knows what America Army is. If you don't know, raise your hand. America's Army. So it was a video game made by Disney and the Army, U.S. Army, a free disc that was handed out in recruiting stations and at high schools to train people and teach people the terrain of Iraq and to hopefully recruit them to fight in the war. And so they had scenes from that, like in three-dimensional, and we kind of were like, you know what, we don't actually want to be in a show that's sponsored by the government or the United States Army. But we are interested in being a critical aspect of the show. Is there some way we can be in a free space? And they said, sure, we'll try to get you external funding. And so we had our own space that we asked to inhabit for 6 weeks as a sort of questioning of the role of technology in our everyday life and in art. One little side note was, right before the show, there was a lack of money, and the U.S. Army said, we'll give you another $1 million if you let us come down on a helicopter the opening night and have soldiers rappel down the side of the museum and like really feel like the game is live. And thank God the board of directors was smart and said that won't happen in San Francisco. So we did a 6-week inhabitants there called Play Shop, and what it was a space of production. You're looking at a sketch we sent to the museum early on called Botanical Game Boy. And we asked them if we could do projects in the space that might fail, do them with the public, and also have a lecture series and invited guests. So this was one project that we did where I worked with Rich Mortimer Humphrey, who's an amazing sort of amateur genius, and Michael Swain on this project. And Rich and he taught me a little bit how to hack an old Game Boy. We made our own game called Count Volta, and the idea was to power a Game Boy with lemons. But we made this sort of silly game about Galvani and Volta, because Volta got all the credit for inventing voltage. But Galvani was actually doing research at the same time, but maybe he was just more humble. So we had this sort of fighting game over the lemon between them. So I just think this is kind of a good thing to show in a school setting. In our studio, we were trying to figure out how much voltage we could get from lemons, and we had set them up in parallel and series and had gotten like 0.5 volts from a quarter of a lemon, and we were like, okay, if we set them up, okay, we'll need like 12 lemon trees. That's enough for us to power the Game Boy. We can power this little calculator with a few lemons, the 2 kumquats for this other calculator. And there's Rich. And then we get to the gallery, and I had bought 14 trees, and all the public's there waiting to see the Game Boy powered. And we start wiring the trees, and we found that the tree actually, so a quarter of a lemon on its own had like around 0.5 volts. The tree, when we wired it in and of itself, had 0.5 volts. But when you took the lemons off, they individually had their 0.5 volts. So there was kind of this moment in the room where the thing was a huge failure. We would need 48,000 trees to power one Game Boy. But But at the same time, we had this sort of epiphany of like, okay, the tree, when it's all in the tree, it's one entity because it shares the electrolytes, but when the plants come off, metaphorically, it was quite beautiful. So we had, in this room, we had a lot of materials and computers, and the people, we had this public, so we're like, what are we going to do? We have people here, we have gadgets and materials. Let's try to teach something. So we had these little Teleo modules. This was 2003. We would use Arduino now, probably. And we just quickly decided to use the lemons as controllers. So we just set up a really quick video projection and taught people how to when you squeeze the lemon, the voltage actually changes. So if there's a positive voltage, the movie would go forward, and if there was a negative voltage, the movie would go back. So for us, it was about trying to capture the improvisation that happens in the studio when you're making in a public space, because I think a lot of that for us is gone once in pieces in the museum or the gallery. It's like all of that magic is in there, but we wanted to kind of open that up. And then another project that we sort of tested out in public was with David Liu, a programmer, and Rich Mortimer Humphrey. And so, right, we're in this gaming show, and we started playing video games, and I started playing Grand Auto Theft. And I thought it was really boring. I was like, this is really boring. I'm not into it. I started going in the woods to try to find out, like, did the 3D modelers put little treasures in the woods or something? And I thought it might be interesting if you, on the controller, could scan your fingerprint and have the city become like a map of your, based on the grid of your finger. And so I called Rich. I'm like, can we do this? And Rich came over, and we just took like a webcam and then a different prism and scanned our fingerprints. And then built this really scrappy fingerprint scanner that was just like a 16mm film lens, a prism, and a mouse capturing device. And then David wrote this little program that would take that JPEG and amplify the resolution and turn it into this high contrast image. And this was another kind of test we did to see, like, okay, do we want to make this kind of a map, or do we want to do a different kind of mapping of that data? So we were at this stage where we were like, is this an interesting idea? I don't know. Let's take it into public and test it. So tons of high school kids would come through this space every day, and we just set up a super scrappy model and asked kids to actually give us feedback. So we had a diagram of how the controller worked, and then kids would scan their fingers, and their fingerprint would be turned into this three-dimensional cube world, and you could kind of fly down into it. And David was really embarrassed because he's like, I'm not a game designer, and I can't get the transparency, the opacity and transparency down. And so people that could actually like fly through the walls, and the teenagers thought that was really great. And then we did another version where, in a different place, where we actually had people scan their fingerprint. The fingerprint would get printed out, and we had a little gallery of fingerprints on the wall. And then people voted for which fingerprint pattern they liked, and we planted it in this little grid. And I don't have any pictures of the growth, but it actually did grow. And then another workshop we did was, I was teaching at the Art Institute in San Francisco at the time, and I was teaching media theory and practice, and I found that a lot of the classes were predominantly male, and that the women had kind of a desire to learn more, but there was like a slower learning curve, and there wasn't a space for them to like get one-on-one instruction. So for a week, we inhabited the space. There was like 12 students from the Art Institute who came, and Scott Snibbe came and taught a class, and Rich Humphrey taught a hacking class. So these two girls came and wanted to start a band with all found electronics, and they all wanted to learn how to make their own computer. So Rich taught them how to take apart an old PC and make a computer in a cardboard box. And so they were like, really liberated. And this actually, Rich works for the California court system. He's an IT person, and this is the computer he brings in to like work in the court offices. Another night we had was called Tea, Toast, and Technology, and this is a local infamous chess player who teaches chess at the Mechanics Institute. And we asked him to come and replay the game between Deep Blue and Kasparov, where Kasparov lost. And he played the whole game and kind of narrated what was going on in Kasparov's mind, because he's actually played Kasparov. And he kind of explained as well what this means for humanity, for the computer to beat a man. And after he did that, he played the rest of the night a whole table of chess games blindfolded and beat everybody. So people would call out their moves, and he'd say B2 and C5 on all the games, and then he'd win them all, and then he'd replay and tell them where they made their mistakes. Another thing we did is we had a wireless cantina workshop. So we asked people to bring cans from home, from canned food, and then we taught the very basic wiring of them, and then we wired the park for the duration of our show so that half of Yerba Buena Center for the Arts had free wireless. But I think one of the most inspiring parts of this project was the aspect of it being a free space. It also served Yerba Buena because we were sort of the PR for Yerba Buena. People would come in and go, "Where am I? I'm at Moscone Center," and we'd say, "Welcome, come in." And this man came every day, and he was kind of he wasn't homeless, but he just had a life where he went to everything that was free, and he had this list in his pocket of the free concert across the street in the church, and he heard that we were soldering one day, and so he brought his soldering his soldering iron, and he brought all these tools with him. And then he'd bring wine and chocolate, and it was just kind of, for us, it was like, wow, this interface to the public is really important, to be doing research when strangers can just walk in, rather than behind these kind of closed, privatized walls, which a lot of times in academia can be a little insular. So I'm gonna jump a little. I just wanted to show you a project that my husband and I, so Stain Skiffalers also collaborates with Futurefarmers. We are asked to do a project in a forest in Belgium. And I had only spent a little time in Belgium, but my first year there I was pretty appalled at what they thought a forest was. We went on a family vacation to the south of Belgium, to the forest, to the wild, and all the trees were in rows. And I was like, "You're kidding, right? Like, this is not the forest." And they had never really even thought, whoa, this for us, trees, just to have trees is forest, because most of Belgium is very pastoral. And so we went to this forest where they were going to commission a whole bunch of public projects there. And the curator was like, "Yes, this is a wild forest." And I was like, "It's in rows, and all you can hear is the freeway. It's like every forest in Belgium has 3 different intersecting freeways going through it or by it." But he was so delighted, this is the wild, and we want to have more people come here, so we think we should have art here. And I really was like, "You're kidding," and no, it wasn't. Anyway, so as we were driving home, we're like, "That's such a weird space. I actually don't want to spend time there, and what can we do there?" So we proposed to have a radio station that broadcasted forest sounds to people passing on the highway, so that when you'd go past this little area, you could tune in to Radio Forest and hear real forest sounds. So that was our proposal. What we found out is that Belgium is really strict in terms of radio, extremely strict. So we tried for a year to actually get access because licenses expire. So we were trying to get a license for the next year, and this is an ongoing project. It probably will go on forever. So what we decided to do was kind of take steps towards that. So we did kind of audio mixing workshops, and we curated a sound library in this forest. A lot of kids come and walk through this forest, and we thought we should access them somehow. So we built this little cabin called Radio Forest in the forest. They wanted it to be very stable, and we wanted it to be more like the first image I showed you. But anyway, so inside was a radio station, a library of LPs that we collected from locals. We had a day where we invited locals to come and bring their 10 favorite LPs, and we interviewed them about why they liked the LPs, or what their favorite song was, and we archived all of that, and then that's broadcasted. We had radios that people could check out and go walk around in the forest, and you could turn them on, and it would play forest sounds from other forests in the world. So we curated about 12 different audio pieces of forests in like Taiwan and South America. And you could also do it with headphones on. And you could change the channels to tune into different forests. So this is like the scrappy beginning of this radio station, which probably will not be done for about 8 more years. But a lot of people were charmed by this cabin. Hikers who would come to the wild would come in and visit us while we were building it out. And now, quickly, I'm going to go to a project that's still in development, but this is called DIY Hydrogen Algae Bioreactor. This was inspired by thinking about how can we individually produce power. Like, I feel like, we eat food every day. We eat pounds and pounds of food. A lot of it comes out, a lot less comes out than we put in. Where does all that energy go? And I started doing a lot of research on kind of energy production and consumption on an individual level. And I found this article in Wired actually called Hydrogen from Pond Scum. And it was a scientist at UC Berkeley who had discovered that certain strains of algae produced hydrogen. So I went to visit him in Berkeley, Tassios Milas, and he showed me his science, which is basically many strains of algae produce hydrogen. Under certain conditions, they produce more or less. And many scientists are trying to figure out which strains produce the most. That's a big task for them. And I was like, it's so easy. Shouldn't we have backyard models? And he was like, actually, I built this $100 model. It's all it is a plastic bag that is inflated with water, inoculated with algae, and how the cycle works is you deplete the algae you don't give it any oxygen, and after a certain amount of time, depending on what strain it is, it starts to produce hydrogen. You harvest that hydrogen, you give it oxygen again, and the cycle can continue. And I was like, well, if it's so easy, why aren't more people doing this? And it's not quite optimized. And he said what they really want to do is amplify this and make it happen on an industrial level. And so I asked one of his students if he would come into a gallery space with us and demonstrate the science and try to make a home brew version of this with all off-the-shelf objects. So these are like Strauss milk containers, beer bottles, chopsticks, the oxygen tank you can get. And so Jonathan Muser came and explained this whole science, and we got really inspired. Michael Swain and I were like, what's the hurdle of this science? Like, why isn't it happening? And at this time, Bush administration was still there, and all of the money from the National Renewable Energy Lab had been taken out and given to a lab in Florida, and oil is still, the most powerful attractor of national funding. And they said, what we need is 1 million people to be looking at strains to figure out what's the most productive. And so this was the first stage of a project we did together. And then, this is just a description of like one way they want to make this on an industrial scale is actually have these intestinal tracts kind of running on surplus land, like the sides of freeways or in deserts. And all you need is like a membrane so they can be on roofs. And this was my scrappy version of suburban algae production. But what we've done is we were kind of kidding, and I was like, well, if you need people to kind of scratch the surface of the algae to find out what's most productive, wouldn't it be great to distribute these kits to high school students or students to do the first level of research so that they could just send back the ones that are productive to the lab so that scientists wouldn't be kind of wasting their time going, okay, this one doesn't produce at all. And Jonathan got really excited, and he was working at the National Renewable Energy Lab and said, let's ask my mentors if they'd help us produce some of these kits. So we produced this Lunchbox Laboratory. It was actually for a show at the New York MoMA called Design in the Elastic Mind. And it's a very clumsy prototype, but it was very useful for the National Renewable Energy Lab and the educational department there to think about how we can produce these on a larger scale. So basically it's these kits that are distributed with 7 different strains of algae. And algae can be found anywhere, like even if you scrape the insides of an airplane, commercial jetliner, there's algae in there from our breathing, just from that humidity. So there's sensors in each of these test tubes, which were invented based on this Lunchbox Laboratory, which was a big leap. One of the scientists at the lab, Michael Siebert, actually invented a chemical sensor that when it senses hydrogen, it turns blue. So each one of these lids, when it senses hydrogen, turns blue, and little LEDs show how much production is happening. So right now, we've received a grant to take this to the next level with the National Renewable Energy Lab, and we're making 100 of these to send out to 2 different high schools. Late night production. And then I'm almost done with my lecture, but this next thing I'm going to talk about is a little long, so I just wanted everyone to stand up for 1 second. And just kind of like stand up and breathe. And you can sit back down. So, the next project I wanted to talk about is, it's not 2007 anymore, it's 2009, was a project that was inspired by living in Belgium for 4 summers. My husband's from Belgium, so we go there in the summertime. And one summer I was planting a garden in front of our studio, but a really, really small one. I'd just taken cobblestones out of the sidewalk and put dirt in, and this really old woman who I'd seen for years came by, and she was like, blah, 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 the staat, blah, 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 the staat. And I didn't understand enough Dutch, but I knew she was saying something about the city, and I was like, oh, I'm going to get in trouble because I took the cobblestones out. This is a socialist city where we lived in Ghent. The government is socialist. You have to have your mailbox at a certain height and a certain color. And my husband came out because he heard her, and he was smiling. And he's like, no, she's telling you to save your seeds and your receipt from your seeds and your soil to send to the city so you can get reimbursed. And I was like, wow. And then she got really excited. She's like, Klein Garden. She was like, little garden. I was so excited. And she went and told the neighbors that I was planting a garden, and they came with wine and champagne. And the whole neighborhood, who we had not really met, came out and celebrated until 3 in the morning. I went to bed at 1, but they were out on the street around this. I'm not kidding, the garden was like that big. And so I went to the city website to find out not that city. I went to the city website to find out what the program was because I wanted to get reimbursed. And it was called Bebloemingsacties, which means planting action. And it was subsidies for all kinds of greening initiatives. So 2 times a year you could get reimbursed for soil and seeds. You could get €3,000 to put a green roof on. You could get €3,500 to put a window into your basement so that bats could live in your basement because they're a natural pesticide. They eat spiders and mosquitoes. And on the city website, it said really joyfully, like, please be part of this program. Our air will be cleaner. And when airplanes fly over Ghent, they'll see a blanket of green. And I was kind of like, why is this so playful? Like, our city government websites are so dry and boring. And, I actually want to be part of this program. And so I started thinking about, we were fed up with Belgium and wanted to move back to San Francisco. Fed up with San Francisco for certain reasons, but wanted to move back. And I was like, why isn't something like this in San Francisco? And we have a, all year round growing season, and San Francisco is trying to reach all these peak oil numbers. So I started reading about the history of gardening in America, and I went to the San Francisco library and found this image. If you haven't figured it out, I really like archives. And in 1943, there was a garden in front of City Hall, and I was like, wow, there was this farm in front of City Hall. What was this? And it was part of a national program, which probably a lot of you have heard about by now. It's been in the news a lot, but it was called the Victory Gardens Program. And in 1941, basically, we were a country at war. A lot of our farmers were soldiers in Europe. A lot of our food was being sent over to our soldiers, and because there was a famine, and our country was hungry and very demoralized, or the morale was very low. And so the government got together and said, okay, how can we solve these two problems? Let's build a nation of self-reliant citizens, and let's get something out of it. So they started a program and made a guide, 12-page guide, and sent it to every city in America. The guide actually pretty much holds true today. If you just picked it up as a city, it's pretty amazing. They suggested that every park have a garden, every school have a garden, every business with surplus land have a garden, and give time to their employees to grow food. They suggest in this guide that as a neighborhood you should get together and take slides of your gardens, and at the local cinema before the show you should show slides of your garden. They said every neighborhood should have a newsletter and a comic artist to keep the humor alive. In San Francisco, in most of my research, was the most successful program. All the parks had gardens. This is Golden Gate Park with 850 plots. This is sort of as they were growing, and I love, you can't really tell, but all the men and women are very dressed up when they're gardening. After school programs, Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts became victory gardeners on surplus land. And with the program came a lot of propaganda. Cities were flooded with posters. I'm just going to, whoops, some are too big, show you a lot of the posters. Also, it was sort of a beginning of feminist culture because a lot of women started to farm, and through that and this propaganda, we're really empowered, as you'll see. Another part of the program was that neighborhoods had tool lending libraries and seed libraries. So the government distributed really, really cheap seeds, sometimes free. This is a tool lending library. All churches and recreation centers were asked to open up once a month to do canning sessions and lessons. And so I was kind of like, wow, what an amazing program. Why doesn't this exist now? And I started to think about space in San Francisco because the Victory Garden program was really targeted towards backyards. And in the Sunset District, backyard lots are actually huge. And I went to the city and asked if they had a plan and a zoning of housing and backyards. And in 1970 was the last study where they looked at how big the plots were of land, backyards, according to how big the house was. And I started thinking about, okay, if all of this is added together, we have a lot of space that can be farmed. And, 1,800 acres is quite a big farm. And so I was asked to be in a show at the SF MoMA, and I thought, I'm just going to try to make a utopian proposal to the city as my project to reinstate this program. And so I made a series of sculptures that I felt like were sort of these, rather than printed propaganda, three-dimensional propaganda for a new realization of a Victory Garden program. So, pogo stick, shovel. I was thinking of imagining a fleet of gardeners, silent gardeners, without power tools or cars that would flank the city. I made a trike with a bike builder, Paul Sozowski, in San Francisco, where the front comes off for the hills in San Francisco so you can push your tools and supplies up the hills. I proposed that we should have a seed library to promote bioregional seeds, which basically sustain nutrition and are hardier if we grow seeds from the place where they're actually meant to be grown. And then I did a very small pilot program, just kind of by myself, where I gave away 3 gardens. I put an ad on Craigslist and said, I'm trying to do this new program, and I'm going to give away 3 gardens. And within the first night, I had 320 responses. And I was like, wow. And the responses I had were amazing. They were like single mothers whose teenage kids couldn't afford to feed them healthy food anymore. They used to shop at the organic store, but now they have to shop at Safeway. There were people who were HIV positive, who wanted more control over their food. And I started thinking, this is getting more credible, like the need for this program. And so I called a former board of supervisor from the city, Matt Gonzalez, and asked if he would help me approach the city. So he came to one of these parties, and we would throw a planting party where we'd give away the garden and invite the whole neighborhood and put these posters up all over the neighborhood and get the neighbors excited, and ask them to take a good gardening oath to tend to the garden for 2 years and save their seeds. And this was one of the gardens that we gave away to, and this one I chose mostly on a gut feeling. It was a family of 10 Asian Americans living in a really small house with a huge backyard, and I wanted to show you this picture because it really shows the different land use of these backyards. One is literally not used at all. It's basically a sand dune, like the Sunset District is. The Yee's house actually is half dirt, half cement, and the other person is like completely covered with cement. These were the kids. So he came in and basically only gave them 2 boxes of food, and this family decided to actually grow the rest of their garden. So we came in with about 10 people and did this in a couple of hours, and then they kind of went from there. I came back to visit them about 3 months later, and they had built a greenhouse, and they had kind of deconstructed our boxes and made them bigger and reconfigured their entire garden, and now this is their garden that's growing. And so I took this super mini pilot project to the city. The Board of Supervisors agreed to meet with me, and he said, okay, I'll give you 3 minutes. What do you want? I was like, okay, here's this historical program. There was a garden in front of City Hall. Here's all these emails from Craigslist. You have this peak oil program. I want a garden in front of City Hall again. I want funding for backyard gardening programs to help people to get funds and tools and education on how to grow food. And I want a seed library. And I want to, I kept asking for things. He's like, okay, we can get you the garden in front of City Hall. We can get you the money for the backyard garden program. But I want to have a meeting with more city groups, city departments, to see how other people can help us. And I was kind of like, whoa, be careful what you wish for. So he said, let's do another meeting next week. And at this point, I'm like, I'm an artist, and I don't really want to be a politician. What if I want this to happen, but I can't do it alone. So I called a local garden group organization and asked if they would partner. So we partnered right away. They were like, yes, let's do this. We went to the City Hall, and basically the city was like, let's do this on a grand scale. Let's plant 500 gardens. And we were kind of like, wow, exciting, and one of the the director of the Department for the Environment was like, wait a minute, this is a typical city thing to do. Plant 500 gardens in a new program, 400 are going to die, and then next year you're going to have this failed program and nobody's going to want to take it to the next step. We should plant 15 gardens this year and work with all the families really closely, make them all thrive, have tours with people from all around the world who are coming, to these meetings in the city about global warming and peak oil, and make them, make it work. And so that's what we did. We got a grant to plant 15. We put out applications in Chinese, Spanish, English, at all libraries, online, etc. And we got 1,300 applications in 3 weeks. And the applications were amazing. The thing that happened was that most of them were from an economic bracket of people who made more than $80,000 a year, which shows that most people probably got them off online. But what that showed was that we could actually, and on their applications they said, I would pay for this program. I would pay someone to come and farm my yard if I could get some of the food. So what that kind of revealed was that actually the program could fund itself. If people are paying, the people who can't pay can actually get a garden. This is just a note that Mr. Lin wrote to me one day. He doesn't speak any English, and I just think it's kind of beautiful. And so we were like, okay, let's push them while the city is open to recreate this garden in front of City Hall. At this point, Alice Waters was doing the Slow Food Nation Festival And this is Civic Center. They were going to build a big, long table for their festival and have like a harvest meal. And one of the landscape architects, John Bella, had heard about Victory Gardens, and he was hired to design the table. And he was like, I'm going to call, like, would you want to do a Victory Garden with Alice Waters? And we were like, actually, that'd be great, because the one condition the city said is that we need a security guard 24 hours a day if we're going to have a garden, and we just couldn't afford it. So Alice Waters really funded this project, and that was good and bad. But one thing that happened was we proposed that each of these circles was a gardening organization that was funded by the city, and not just San Francisco, but Bay Area wide. And the reason why I was excited about this is that a lot of these groups compete for the same funding, and they sort of keep to themselves, and they don't really cross-pollinate. And we had several town hall meetings to say, who's going to tend to this? How are we going to support it? How's it going to work? And through this kind of community of community gardens, it kind of galvanized the community. So this was the garden that was planted in July. There was a planting day, which I think there was probably more media than people, but there were 350 people there. So each group got to choose the plants they wanted to plant in these raised beds, and people could come and help and kind of learn different techniques from different groups. And I show this more for the European audience to show our fancy Tom Cruise mayor. This is our mayor who actually came and planted plants. And then I'm just going to close by saying that that project lasted through November. We, at one point, were harvesting 500 pounds of food per week, and all of the food went to food banks in the neighborhood, and people could glean as much as they wanted. But through that project, it really generated a culture of gardening and food. And so the group that I've partnered with, Garden for the Environment, has a teaching garden, and we've tried to cultivate more activities in these garden spaces through the city. So we've done one-day libraries. This is Ian Bull, an amazing writer, geographer, giving a reading. We asked people to bring 10 books, and we created a temporary library. And we also did a film screening, but I'm going to end there because I want to hear questions. So thank you.
Okay, so we have time for questions. We are recording, so you just need the mic before you ask. Anybody want to go first? Okay, thanks, Peter.
Okay, that was, as usual, inspiring, fantastic, wonderful. The question that I think probably goes through a lot of students' minds is, how do you get to this position? In other words, how do you get to the point where you have work that supports this other kind of work? How did you do that over the years? I mean, if that's not too hard a question. In other words, how does this work within capitalism as opposed to socialist gardening?
I always feel like it's just luck in the right place at the right time. I mean, how I got into to being at a place with Futurefarmers as a design studio is really a fluke, and I was working as an intern at a photo magazine, and I had to design things, and people kept saying, will you design, this and that for me? And someone said, do you want to do an online magazine of photojournalists who publish their work in magazines, but they go to these crazy places, do all these, take all these crazy pictures, and then only 5 pictures get published. Do you want to create something where the real story gets published? And I was like, yes. I studied photojournalism in undergrad, and I was like, a magazine, great. But I didn't know what an online magazine was. I didn't know what the internet was. It was like 1993. Long story short, did this online magazine, and it was just the right time and the right place. San Francisco, 1994. Wired magazine did a story on it, and all of a sudden we got this call from NTT from Japan, who makes supercomputers and satellites, and they're like, we want you to do our international website. And at this point, I was literally an intern artist. Olivier Laude, who was the photojournalist, was a photojournalist. His office was his car, and our programmer was a writer, academic, who was in his closet, like, doing JavaScript on the side. And we were like, okay, this company wants to come and do this project. And Olivier was like, come on, let's do it. Let's roost in our friend's design studio. We'll make fake business cards, and we'll pretend like it's our office. And I was like 23 at this time, and they were 30. And we have this meeting. The company comes from Japan with like 12 people in suits. And I'm like, before they came, I'm like, Olivier, you have to tell them the truth. I can't do this, you know, like we're a virtual office. And so they came and they asked us all sorts of questions about our childhood and like nothing about business. And finally, Olivier said, you know, we're not, this isn't our office, and Amy works at home, and no. And they're like, wow, that's so innovative. Can we come next time with more people to visit where you work? And I was like, I lived with like 5 punk rock guys, and it was this messy house, and they came to all of our places. And then they said, we want to hire you. We visited Organic, we visited the other people, but we think you're very inventive, and we're going to rent you a suite at the Marriott, and we're going to bring our president, and we want you, in our company, we want you to tell them what the internet is. And we were like, okay. But so anyway, we ended up doing the international website for NTT, and we kind of, through talking to them, found out like, okay, what else do? You know, what's the bad things you do? And they wouldn't talk about anything bad that they did. They told us they did do a lot of research where they tracked birds to find out where certain swans went at parts of the year. And so we kind of convinced them to do an online magazine as part of their international website. So it wasn't just about products, it was also about content. And I think it was just something that at that time was interesting, and I just always feel like we just kept riding this wave, and you know, things just come to us kind of randomly. It's not something we've searched out, but I feel really fortunate that we have this avenue of having an income that we can fund our own projects. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, next.
Hi, I'm just wondering if the Victory Gardens have expanded to any other cities, like LA or beyond?
Not in exact form, but there's a group in Austin that emerged from it that I worked a lot with, called Austin Green, and then UC Berkeley's putting in a Victory Garden. A group of students that I've been sort of mentoring is doing a garden, and I mean, nothing like exactly. A lot of cities have written us asking us like, how did you do it? How did you know, what are the steps? And we've kind of talked people through things, but nothing verbatim.
So, Amy, so the Victory Gardens project is also shown in, as we know, at Montreal as part of this really quite amazing exhibition actions. So just because we have also many undergraduate students here, so I was just wondering if you would like to talk a little bit about that sort of like that actions exhibition and how you feel that that relates in general to the kind of line of work that you are sort of like developing.
I think it's about participation. So there's a show in Montreal right now called Actions, What Can We Do With Our City? And I think the underlining theme of that show that I've found was participation, and that a lot of the projects instigate people to be participants as individuals and as groups, and to make us question what can we contribute to a city individually or collectively that can change the notion of a city, and to make it more of a space of participation, and that we can actually make change. I think in terms of Victory Gardens, that something that made me think differently was that I think a lot of times I've always thought of the government as them and we're us, and it's this different thing. But by participating and understanding local politics, you find different ways to get in as an artist, because within a lot of this dry policy, there's a lot of loopholes. And I think in the actions show, a lot of us are trying to look at where the government doesn't have time to look, or where they've made mistakes, or where they haven't had time to make the laws yet, and try to fit into those spaces to make new possibilities. One group, which you might have heard about, is Rebar is in the show, and they've done this parking day. I think maybe you've heard of parking day, where they started it out as an intervention where, okay, you put your quarter in the parking meter, but what if you don't put a car there? What if you put something else on wheels and turn it into a park? So they made this mobile park and would just keep feeding the meter until they got a ticket. But now it's a national day. People all over the country do parking day, and it's basically a rebellion against the car. And I think basically my theory is that there's more and more people in cities, and just from the perspective of San Francisco, that it's really hard to govern all of these people. So it's leaving more opportunities for people to self-govern and become more self-reliant. I don't know if that answered your question a bit.
Any more questions?
If you could have unlimited funding, what would be your dream project?
I have a lot. I still want to turn the row houses in Baltimore that are abandoned into wind powered. I want to build windmills on top of all the row houses in Baltimore. I think I'd start a school that wasn't a school. I would be a permanent grad student.
Anything else? Okay. That's okay.
Having come from a non-science background and working in a lot of scientific fields now, did you feel welcomed by the scientific community as an artist, or were there any apprehensions?
Yeah, really, all the time. Even at Stanford, when I would go kind of sniff around the labs, scientists seem very liberated by not having to work completely in theory. Like when we actually make something, it's very exciting. And I think with Jonathan, the exciting thing for him is to actually bring his privatized research out into a public realm. Because scientists get kind of lost in their lab, and it's like, whoa, there's this other world out there. And you know, we've actually continued to work with him for 5 years now, and I think I've worked with a butterfly scientist, and he said something really interesting. I was like, to me, science is a lot like art. You're looking, you're observing, you're making theories. And he was like, yeah, I tell my students that, except scientists have to match their research to reality. And I was like, what if you didn't have to match your research to reality? But I just thought that was something interesting.
Do we have time for one last, or that could be the last? Okay, Carla.
Since you have such eclectic interests, I'm curious what your regular reading list is.
My husband would crack up. I'm a really horrible reader. I never read a book front to back, so I have stacks and stacks of books by my bed, like a lot of us do. I think right now I'm reading a lot about cities, and I just bought 10 books at the Canadian Center for Architecture. One is about the history of asphalt, and just thinking about how the system of the city works and doesn't work, because I feel like I never studied urban planning, and but I tend to read things that I'm doing projects about. I rarely read fiction, and I wish I read more fiction, but
on a regular basis, are there, other than books, are there things that you read that might spark a new interest? Because it seems like you've gone from one interest to another. You talked about what your undergraduate work, it didn't seem to necessarily lead you where you are, or one wouldn't have expected it.
Yeah, it wasn't expected, but I think everything I read inspires me. I mean, sometimes you have to turn it off, like, okay, I don't need to read for a while because I think, yeah, on many levels, I'm reading like 3 different things at once, and they're all feeding into each other, but yeah. Thank you.
That's no problem. I'm happy to do it.
Thank you
so much. That was wonderful, wonderful.